It's my pleasure to introduce Steve Levitt and Chad Syverson, both of the University of Chicago. So 2020 has been a unique year for most people, and let's start with a baseline though. What hasn't surprised you about 2020? What fundamentals still remain, either about the economy or about how we apply economics?
Chad, do you want that, or should I take it first, Craig?
Go ahead.
Okay. I would say the one thing that hasn't surprised me is that, conditional on having a pandemic, the fact that we have handled it miserably is not a surprise at all, because pandemics are essentially about externalities. And we know, like, if there's one thing economists understand, it's externalities. And the fact that when I'm sick, I spread it to other people and don't pay the cost just tells you that, especially in a country like the US, you're going to struggle mightily in trying to internalize those externalities. And I think we almost could not have done worse at internalizing externalities. But like history is, if there's one thing we've learned in history, is that internalizing externalities is a very difficult thing. And it's a case where markets fail unless you have strong government intervention.
I basically agree with that. To be honest, the magnitude of people's willingness to stay at home, at least in the first, I don't know, 6 to 10 weeks, surprised me. I mean, if you would have asked me 6 months before it all began, how long would something like that last? I'm not sure I would have given it 2 weeks. So there was more than I thought initially, but I agree, it's basically fallen.
I mean, I think
internalizing.
I think what your research shows is, the way I interpret your research with Austin is not that people are doing it out of the goodness of their heart, but they just have tremendous fear for their own private incentives. And it's like, and that's, I think.
That, you know, yeah, no, I agree. Maybe I would say people acted even more strongly than I would have thought they would, even if it's only for their own sake. I would have thought there'd be, you know, kind of more careless attitudes about it, or the stuff we see now, it's just, some of it seems just oppositional. Like, I'm not going to do this just because people want me to. There was much less of that early, and yeah, I think what Austin and I found was a lot of it was people were just worried about what was happening to themselves and their families.
Hey, Jack, can I ask you a macroeconomic question that I don't know the answer to?
Sure.
So it seems like nobody's doing anything, but GDP hasn't gone down very much. Is that just because G went way up, and I and C and everything else? And if that's true, how come none of the macroeconomists seem to be worried about the fact that, like, it's generally not a really good thing to spend G to infinity without any change in taxes, like a decline in the tax base? But like, the macroeconomists don't seem too worried about it.
So I'm gonna reveal that I don't know quite all the details of national income accounting. Here's what I know: national income went way up in the second quarter, even as GDP went down. GDP went down a lot year on a annualized basis. Maybe it was 8%, something like that total for the quarter. So the government spending showed up. I'm not sure so much of it showed up in terms of pure expenditures, which is on the GDP side. It definitely was on the national income side, the payments to people, both through the unemployment replacement and the $1,500 checks and things like that. I was just actually looking at a paper about what a big effect that had on especially lower income household spending. So that actually goes into C. That would, to the extent they spent it immediately in the second quarter, and I think the numbers were about 16 to 20%, something like that, got spent immediately. Now, all that, to some extent, I think one thing that's useful to remember, some of what was going on is just intertemporal shifting. So people would have bought a car in the second quarter, they didn't. That's moving to quarter 3 or 4, maybe next year once someone gets reemployed. Maybe the macroeconomists should or shouldn't worry about that. I don't know. The bigger thing is there's a bunch of service spending that will probably never get respent, and that's going to be a permanent loss in income for this year. And whether it's got persistent effects, I don't know. If you start looking at the permanent job loss numbers, though, it does make you think some of this stuff is going to stick around.
Chuck, can I see your job one more time and ask one more question in the chat? So obviously the thing we really care about is productivity, because productivity in the long run is what dictates everything. I mean, is this got to be like the worst productivity nightmare in the world, right?
Okay, so I've written about that. Here, the worst nightmare in the world, I don't know. So what's good, what's bad? Here's what might be bad: that when a bunch of companies go out of business, you destroy a bunch of intangible capital. We sort of know that. We don't know kind of how big it is, but we're going to have massive failures of companies. We propped them up for a few months, but that's fading now. And I think we're going to see a lot of exit. Small companies, by and large, not the larger ones, but there's still in aggregate maybe a lot of intangible capital there. On the other hand, we know that on average, this churning process of entry and exit of companies, at least on net, tends to raise productivity. The companies that come in are more efficient than the ones that go out of business. What I worry about now is that this shock has been so enormous and so wide-ranging and willy-nilly that there's this usual relationship of the weaker, less productive companies on net going out of business has gone away, and now it's just everyone's going out of business, and so there's no sort of compositional productivity growth. And now I don't know whether that's happening or not. We don't have good numbers to measure productivity of exiting companies that quickly, but I think in a year or two we'll know. And that to me is one of the biggest worries about productivity growth going forward, along with, and interesting, that's sort of the opposite side of this: prop up the companies to save their intangible capital. Well, if you prop up the wrong ones, you get these zombie firms who aren't very efficient, and you don't get this beneficial churn. So time will tell what the net effect is. I mean, one thing that's maybe a little hopeful, if you want to reach back far in history, the 1930s were actually a pretty decent year for total factor productivity growth in the US, and obviously that's during the Great Depression. You can tell stories where this sort of shock creates retrenchment and people get new ideas and stuff like that. I don't know that's actually happening, but if we want to cross our fingers about something, that might be something to hang our hat on.
And what about a kind of learning by doing model of, like, I would have thought productivity doesn't come from magic. I mean, maybe it comes from magic, because maybe productivity is about ideas, but I more think of productivity as a bunch of people puttering around doing stuff and getting a little bit better because they're doing it. But sitting at home, it doesn't seem like anybody's getting better sitting at home, you know?
Okay, I'm not going to argue with that. And of course, you and I, we wrote a paper on learning by doing together. I mean, there's some learning. We're figuring out how to do this, and this might not be a perfect substitute for this sort of event, but you know what? It might be a better substitute for other things we used to do the sort of slow physical way. And if you imagine, we just take now the max of either physical. Once everyone gets better, we can go places if we want to. We take the max of this versus the old physical way. We could actually be better off once we've paid the cost. And that's one thing to remember, is all these adjustment costs we've been sinking into figuring out how to use, WebEx kind of software and things like that. That you're supposed to, that goes in the denominator of productivity. That's a cost, and we don't want to forget about that in the future. But maybe going forward, we'll be able to amortize some of that, and it'll be on net a little more beneficial.
That's true. If I never step on another airplane, I will view COVID as a net positive, I think.
Yeah, the amount of my life I spent flying has come into sharp relief when I'm not doing it anymore. That's for sure. I'm sure you feel the same way.
So does that change permanently in your mind now? You talked in, I think it was in May chat, around the idea of like what irreversibilities might we experience that don't return to a norm or don't return to a status quo. What are we at risk of losing? What are now 6 months, 7 months later, are we starting to see maybe take hold?
I think, I mean, so retail has actually, I think, weathered things all right. A lot aggregate retail, partially because just there's been such large substitution in online. If a retailer had an online presence, they've been able to weather it okay. I think the sectors that lagged the worst, even restaurants and bars, came back faster than I would have guessed. I think the hospitality stuff, since we're talking about travel, leisure, hospitality, probably isn't going to come back to normal for a while. How much is irreversible? I can imagine, I've flown out to the East Coast for 45-minute long meetings before. I'm not sure that that's going to happen with the same frequency going forward that it did. That sort of stuff, maybe people will vacation differently in the future. I don't know. I think a lot of the irreversibilities are going back to what Steve was talking about, like just sort of organizational capital and stuff that might get lost for these businesses. So, I mean, they're not big businesses at the unit level, but they're big in aggregate. Think about restaurants. Like a ton of restaurants have gone and will go out of business. I think, despite my just saying that the sector hasn't done as bad as I thought, it's obviously suffered a huge hit to demand. When the pandemic's over, my supposition is people are still going to want to go out to eat. In fact, there might be a little pent-up demand. So there's going to be reason for new restaurants to come in and serve that demand. I don't think the worry is for the next 10 years we're all going to be searching around trying to find a restaurant we can go eat at, and reservations will be impossible because half of the restaurants are gone. Restaurants will come back, but the thing is, the restaurants that had figured it out and done well, some of those have gone out of business, and you're going to have to resync all the learning process to go back to what we were just talking about. That's all going to have to be repaid. That's the sunk stuff that you got to pay all over again that I was mentioning before. I think that's kind of those irreversibilities are the costs we're going to have to repay. And again, that's just a cost we don't get with any net output in the end.
Have you seen the Larry Summers and David Cutler paper that just came out, Chad? I think it was just an accounting, attempting to account for the costs.
Yeah, Ben Jones. Wasn't it Larry and Ben Jones? I think maybe they were trying to figure out the total. Or are you talking about the total returns to R&D, social returns to R&D, or is this a different one?
No, this is a paper that literally came out yesterday. Larry Summers and David Cutler.
Okay, I didn't see that.
On the cost of COVID, and their claim, which again didn't make no sense to me, I think they claimed that it was a cost of $200,000 per household in the U.S., which seems kind of impossible because that seems like bigger than the actual like total wealth of the.
Isn't that going and taking away 4 years of income from the median household, or 3.5 years of income?
Yeah, that's why I was asking. I haven't had a chance to read it. I just saw the number, and they said only 25% of the cost they were saying was lost life. They were taking $7 million per life, multiplying that out. I think that already gets you to a big number.
Yeah.
But
I was running those numbers at the beginning, and yeah, with 100, whatever, over 200,000 lives now, you get to a big number pretty quickly. But we should be careful. I should be careful. If my years of income was obviously just pecuniary, or it wasn't counting the value of life and value of health, so you got to add on top of that, which is a pretty big number at the household level. So maybe the $200,000 is coming mostly from that side of the ledger. And did you say they had a fraction that was
1/4? So 1/4 of that, they attributed that to loss of life.
Did they have a big morbidity number?
Honestly, I only saw the headline. I didn't have a chance to look into it. I was just struck by it because of that, along with the what is this Barrington thing? Have you paid any attention to the Barrington thing?
No.
So the Barrington thing, again, I know nothing about it, but people we know and respect, like Jay Bhattacharya and some famous scientists, just got together and basically, I think they said, paraphrasing, like shutdowns don't work. We just got to kind of live with this.
Yeah, well, I mean,
or be smarter, I don't know. Let the people who are at risk figure out how to protect themselves, and everybody just go on doing whatever they want to do.
I mean, that's a little bit what Austin and I found, is that the shutdown orders themselves really had pretty modest effects. The big declines in the economy were coming again from people's own volition. They were concerned themselves about contracting the disease. So yeah, I actually don't see a world, even if things spike up. Well, they are spiking up again. If they continue to spike up again, where we go to this, countrywide, it won't be countrywide, but state by state across the country shutdown orders.
But Europe is doing it. Parts of Europe are doing it. Israel just did it. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. One, I don't know about the wisdom of it. Two, I don't know if the polity in the US is going to respond to it the way they might in the other places.
So what does this, in a way, what does this tell us a bit about both economics and policy's ability to tackle the big questions? Has COVID, shown light on inability to do it or an ability to do it? And I think of, Steve, a conversation you had with Kevin Murphy, background determining the right economic tool in the toolkit that you need to apply to the problem at hand. And when you think about COVID or climate change, racial injustice, who's applying those tools well? And is it going to be at the individual level? Is that social, the social community level, corporations, government? Who's applying the toolkit properly as they think about these bigger questions, or are we really lacking in that area?
Well, I would answer that quickly and then give Chad to my own feeling, my own experiences on the edges of policy and talking to people like Austin Goolsbee who've done real policy. The economists don't have a very loud voice. I'm not sure if we should have a loud voice, but we do not have a very loud voice. And the policies that are being pursued very rarely are the policies that economics, and certainly Chicago price theory, would say are the ones that we should pursue, right? Those, in many cases, it's because those policies would not be, very palatable or popular politically. So I'm sure we don't have Austin here because he could answer that question better. But I would say that whether it's climate change, whether it's COVID, I think we have not done it. We are not doing things in the way economists would say to do them really at all. I mean, like switch to climate change for a second, right? So climate change, again, it's a really clear externality, and they're really, in many ways, really simple answers to how you deal with the externalities, which is that you tax, right? You internalize externality through a Pigouvian tax. And while there's discussion of this, I mean, it's hard because who knows what the right dollar value is. It's a global problem. I'm not saying it's easy, but for sure, I think economists would not say that the right approach is we're just going to tell everybody we're going to sign a treaty that says every country is going to do the right thing, okay? And we're all going to pledge to do the right thing. And in 20 years, we're going to come back and say, oh my God, why didn't anyone do the right thing? How come no one's doing the right thing? I think what's more surprising to economists, in some sense, a lot of the European countries are trying to do the right thing. And you really wonder why, because it's such a small part of the overall global production, but they're taking really big costs to try to do the right thing, what they perceive as the right thing. So I don't think it's any puzzle that the policies being pursued do not look like the policies that economists would do. It would be interesting to put the economists in charge for a year and see what would happen if we got to do what we wanted to do. I'm not sure there must have been a country somewhere that's tried it. I tried to find an example. Actually, for our book, I tried to go through and figure out how many countries have been run by people who say, hey, these, and the number was vanishingly small. And so I think we haven't really ever had our shot at doing it. What do you think, Jeff? What's your answer?
No, I think that's right. Yeah, when I look at these big policies, it's not like, oh, there's a lot of economics behind that. Maybe I'd tweak this or that on the edges. It's like, this is not what an economist would do. I mean, so let me talk about the way I view COVID policy. So I actually don't blame anybody for doing the shutdowns very early. We didn't know how bad it was. It was clear it was exploding. You don't know how these things can go. So fine, let's just say the first 2 months were going to look like they were going to look like no matter what. Fine. What I would have expected is more of a, let's think about the trade-offs now. And actually what there was a lot of talk about the substitution between the economy and the disease, the pandemic, but I think there wasn't enough consideration that their complementarities and where addressing the pandemic would help the economy. And so what you want to do is you kind of you want to make a list sort of what are the costs, this is the benefit of this activity economically, this is the cost in terms of what it's going to do to increase the pandemic. And then you create that ratio for all these things, and then you line them up from high to low, and that's what you do. And then you start, if you're going to forbid activities, you cut things based on that line. And I think a lot of that didn't happen for all sorts of reasons. We've done, I think, not a good job of getting ready for schools to be open this year. That's just a big thing, period. For many, for the sake of the students, for the sake of parents being able to go to work if they don't have childcare, the distributional incomes across income levels is clearly remote learning, I think, is more harmful to low income kids than high income kids. All those things would say, of all the activities we want to spend this summer getting ready for, schooling, especially, the lower grades, should be a real focus. Yet there wasn't very much of that. We instead opened the bars everywhere. And, partially that's just because a lot of, I think it's because state income tax or sales tax comes a lot from restaurant and bar sector. And so the state was like, well, we've got this cost center over here, we got this revenue center over here. We're going to open the revenue center at the cost of the cost center, even though in terms of social benefits, you might swap those two. That there's just no economic kind of trading off costs and benefits in that decision. That's just driven completely by the oddities of state finance. And again, what's a cost center? What's a revenue center? So I think, again, if an economist were running things, I don't think it would have worked that way.
I think another thing, which is on a different dimension, but I think important, and not exactly economics, but it's parallel economics. It is shocking to me how even today we know virtually nothing about this disease, about the transmission. I think one thing we've learned is that epidemiology as a field is a complete and total disaster. It's a theory field that's good at building complicated models, but I think everybody, let me put it this way. We don't know even about the flu. We've had 100 years since the 1918 flu epidemic, and we don't know how it's really transmitted. We barely know. There's been 3 studies about, is it through coughing on people or is it through touching things? And if I were to go back and say, what I think the biggest failure is, so COVID comes, and if I were czar, I would have sat down. I would have found 20 of the smartest people around, and I would have them sit down and say, what are the 15 things we need to know about the transmission of this disease to understand both mortality and economic things? So simple things like, how likely are you to get it if you go on an airplane or a subway? Okay, and I think you'd say very realistically now, we have no idea what the answers are to those questions. That there's been minimal research done. And in part, what's happened is we've relied on the standard methods of science, which are people like me and Chad sitting around, not even having lunch because we don't have lunch anymore, saying, hey, we should look into this, and in our leisurely way, kind of doing it. Okay? But the thing is, if we had thought of this differently, and we said, well, this is a war, okay, and in a war, you need a general, okay, and there's going to be one guy in charge, and you're going to maybe violate some, be willing to risk some things on personal liberties, because you'd say, look, if I want to figure out whether this thing gets transmitted on an airplane, maybe I should just put 100 soldiers on an airplane, one of whom's got COVID, and let them cough a bunch and see if people get sick, and then put another one where they put them at. Look, there's ways we know from randomized experiments where, if you are just sensible about it, and you say the value of this information to the world is near infinite, the cost of getting it, compensate people fairly, because there's a bunch of people who are going to get COVID who don't, 20-year-olds who are out parties anyway. Just like at their parties, pay them to like take COVID before. I mean, like the test. Like, there's really simple ways we could use randomized experimentation or even natural experiments to try to figure out the answers to questions. And what shocks me is like we don't know the most basic things about this. And if we were fighting a war against like Iraq or China or Russia, and we knew so little about how the Chinese military worked 6 months in, like it would be unthinkable because we would approach it, we'd figure out how to answer these questions. And I think science has completely failed us, is my view of this. And on certain things like maybe what treatments are, vaccines being a good counterexample, right? Because vaccines, it was a simple problem that we knew how to do. And what we did differently on vaccines is we let 20 companies run in parallel. We basically would never, economics don't support that usually.
We're not there yet, but don't you think the vaccine performance kind of goes against your notion that science has performed poorly here? I mean, it's done as well as
no. So that's the one
vaccine front.
And that's not really but that's not exactly science. That's the government giving $15 billion in subsidies to pharmaceutical companies to go do it, which is exactly what I'm saying. What the government should have done is
I'm going to jump in because we do. I do want to make sure we leave time for all the people that have joined us to have some questions answered. So I imagine that conversation will carry over into the questions that we do have. But I'll invite Clay back in to handle some of the Q&A. So thank you very much, Steve and Chad, for that discussion, and we'll let Clay carry it forward with everyone here at EconEd.
Yeah, great conversation, guys. Thanks for joining us, and we have some questions from our attendees. We'll start with this one. What can we learn from this pandemic about lower income population and the distribution of wealth? Do we think that there'll be any change on kind of how we view lower income populations and the distribution of wealth?
I don't know if there's learn in the sense of like science. I think we sort of know how much of an effect direct government aid can have, especially during a recession. I guess that is something to be learned. And if we want to, we can get money to people quickly. I don't know, do we know anything new about what the distribution looks like? No, but I guess how fiscal policy and to some extent also monetary policy plays across the income distribution. Sure, I think we have learned a lot about that just because we've done such massive interventions and quickly.
And we have one here that says, in the next 5 years, what one behavior would you incentivize if you could? What is the one behavior that you would select if you were running a program to incentivize all Americans?
Okay, that is such a question for Steve. I have definitely let him take it.
Tough for me. I think that's good for you. So let me first say, so if we're talking about COVID, what seems really true is that COVID is best controlled. What the model suggests is that if you aren't testing people who are asymptomatic, you cannot control COVID. That the asymptomatic spread alone is great enough to keep the R naught above 1. And so, and the simple fact is that if you do not incentivize people strongly, asymptomatic people, then they're not going to get tested because pure accident. My own pet idea on this is, look, if I were again the czar, what the government should do, what you could do is, look, if we could convince people truly or falsely that if you say get 16 hours of sleep or take some certain pill within 24 or 48 hours of getting COVID, and you just don't leave your bed for like a week, that you won't be very sick. Okay, so if that were the case, and every paranoid person in this country was like sleeping 16 hours every time they thought the guy was COVID, look, we would be rid of COVID really, really quickly. Because the whole key is how do you keep people who aren't showing symptoms from not, from just staying in bed. Like that's what we wanted to do. That. So, okay, but more broadly, I don't think there's really a question about COVID. Honestly, the thing that maybe I'm most worried about is I'm not very optimistic that the vaccine is going to work the way people imagine it will, and we might be in this for the long run. And I think the education system has just been so disrupted, and I think this is a time to like rethink education, and to come up with creative ideas about helping low-income kids. I mean, I've seen the numbers on low-income kids and their engagement, and it's just like you just couldn't get kids in Chicago public schools just were not showing up at all to online classes. So I don't know the answer to it, but I think that is where I would put some focus, because I think we're in for a big mess. And if you think, the evidence education really matters, and we're not. I think we've never had a shock like this. We've had we've had a lot of positive shocks to education over time. I don't know the last time we've had a negative shock that looks anything like this.
Well, that's funny that you say you don't have the answer, because that was the next question. What are the necessary creative solutions for a transformed educational landscape? What the person in the question linked to some cool hacks on how to use your camera as a document scanner, and how kids are having to learn how to do that, and they're using wire baskets and can of beans and everything to do that. But do you think that there are larger transformational creative ideas out there for education?
I've thought a lot about this. I do believe that there are a lot of technologies. I like focus on math, because math is, I think, easier to think about than reading. Like there are good technologies, remote technologies, that can teach kids math, but they are not. I mean, but somebody's got to get kids to do it. Is the problem, because if the kids spend time in it, it changes the model. We've had this model for 150, 500 years, I don't know, of a classroom of students sitting around, 40 of them with one teacher, and the teacher teams like my own view is that's an incredibly bad model in the first place. That not meaning to offend anyone in the audience, but look, in my own personal case, there's no doubt that if someone who is an amazing lecturer, so when I taught intermediate micro, I know I was not the best teacher of intermediate micro. I'm sure if I could have had somebody amazing, maybe it's Chad, maybe it's Austin, maybe somebody else, teach, a hologram teach the basics of intermediate micro, and let me as a teacher fiddle around the edges, doing the things like that maybe I have a comparative advantage of. Look, it would have been a better class for sure. So I think the whole model we have of education is messed up, and I think as quickly as possible getting into the realm of how do we use technology, and first we use technology to figure out how to teach kids remotely. But look, as long as we're at it, I think we should just go back to scratch and think about overhauling the whole system. Would be my dream.
Chad, do you have a dream you want?
Well, I'm not so sure. I think this whole episode will demonstrate the resilience of the in-person model. It might not be the best way to do everything, but sort of the small c conservative view of it is, if it's lasted that long, it might be for a reason, and maybe that's because it's just the best. Maybe it's the least worst, but it seems to be a pretty robust way of, at least on average, delivering content. I've noticed just I am doing a dual, well, was until some of the MBA students had a party, and now we're going to be remote for the next couple of weeks. I was doing a dual modality class, so I had about a third of the class in person, 2/3 online. And the people in person, they are on a rotation. Not everyone can come to class every day, but man, they are really happy to be in class. I mean, it really, to them, makes a big difference. Now, maybe it's for superficial reasons, but they sure seem like they like to have the personal. And just in terms of me, the sort of eye contact and body language makes an extraordinary amount of difference for me, just trying to know whether what I'm saying is getting across. So in terms of education, I'm a little more worried about the critical thinking skills of everybody. The sort of the rise, maybe it's always been there, we haven't noticed, but the conspiracy thinking and that kind of stuff, to me, makes I don't know. I really get nervous about that when you have this many people, seemingly so many people, believing so many different things that can't possibly be true if you put it to a little scrutiny. If I want the education system to do something, it would be to deliver a different kind of critical thinking skills, I guess.
I would say, so I agree, Chad. In my own teachings, I taught in the spring, and I've always known this about my own teaching, which is that I do 90-minute classes and I have 30 minutes of material. And I just go to the board and I write as slowly as possible, more or less, so that the kids can keep up. And I just like try to entertain a bunch. But I know that, like, honestly, if I had to deliver my content, I could deliver it in 30 minutes, no problem. And I just decided that felt like such a hopeless way to do online that I felt like I was compelled to do something different. So I just bit the bullet for the first time in 25 years. And so I don't know, what do you call it, a reverse classroom or a swap classroom, whatever it's called. So I just acknowledged the fact that I only had 30 minutes material, and I just delivered my 30 minutes of material at regular speed. And so it was like I would record ahead of time for any student that wanted it, the 30 minutes of stuff. And I actually felt strangely, I agree with Jeff. So it would have been 1,000 times better if I could have done this, recorded these lectures, and then gone and spent 60 minutes in the classroom with students actually talking about ideas. But I ended up talking more about ideas and more about the concept of economics and important things than I've ever done before. And it was more work for me. Although in principle, if I had done it better, I could have recorded those 30 minutes once and like had it like forever, and then it would have probably been even less work. So to me, this was actually a case of innovation where I never had the incentive to do it before. I maybe didn't even have the right technology to do it before. But I think that I can be a much better. I think my classes will be much better going forward because if I have enough discipline, I'll stay with this harder method. But what I actually feel more than anything is that 30 minutes of stuff I record could really be anybody, right?
Right.
And it shouldn't be me. It should be like I would rather have the best teacher in the world recording those 30 minutes than have me doing the 60. And that's the sense in which I think, like, Chad, that's what I meant in terms of technology. Is just
Yeah, I get that.
There's some things I teach a course on big data, and one of the things I try to teach on neural networks. I don't even understand neural networks. Like, they completely confuse me. So more or less the way I teach, I say, look, I start with the students. I say, look, I don't understand neural networks. Like, here's my guess at what they are, but like, there's got to be.
I don't know if we can get into neural networks right now.
Teach, but I've tried to learn about neural networks. I just don't understand them. So.
Well, we will pick up neural networks next time. That was a good kickoff to Econ Ed 2020. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Steve Levitt, Chad Syverson, we really appreciate it. Hope you have a great rest of your day.
Great.
You're welcome.
Take care, guys.
It's a lot of fun. Thanks.